So in part 2, let's take a look at some depreciation methods. So in the earlier chapter, we looked briefly at depreciation. We know that our entry for depreciation is depreciation expense and accumulated depreciation. But now we're going to dig into more of what depreciation is. Conceptually, over time, fixed assets lose some value. They lose their ability to provide services. That 20-year-old machine today isn't what it used to be 20 years ago. So that's the idea of depreciation. It loses its ability to provide services. It's not what it used to be. The exception here is land. Land doesn't lose its ability to provide services. Land always keeps its value. We don't depreciate land. Well, the idea is with that machine 20 years old, not what it used to be, we should expense it in a systematic manner throughout its useful life because we're using that machine up. So we should have an expense reflecting that we're using the machine up. It's called depreciation. So 2 types of defined depreciation. And from an accounting perspective, depreciation is depreciation. But depreciation, there's physical depreciation, wear and tear, and functional depreciation, things get obsolete. So that Apple computer from 1987, well, there's some functional depreciation because it's gone obsolete, and I'm sure there's some physical depreciation of wear and tear on it over 26 or so years. So there's 3 things we have to consider when looking at our depreciation expense. First is the initial cost. So remember in part 1, we talked about the cost of machinery. So let's use machinery and equipment, for instance. So the initial cost of machinery and equipment. Not just the cost for the machinery, but also all that other stuff we looked at on that slide of what goes into the cost of machinery. The residual value is what it's worth at the end of its useful life. So if we buy a machine for $100,000, we determine it has a 10-year useful life, and its residual value at the end of the 10 years is $10,000, that means we're going to depreciate $90,000. So we use this example. So say our initial cost is $100,000. It has a 5-year useful life, and the residual value is $10,000. That means we're going to depreciate $90,000 over 5 years. So 2 common depreciation methods is straight line. Straight line is what it says it is. So if you're going to depreciate $100,000 over 5 years, it's $20,000 a year, straight line. Double declining balance is a more accelerated method of calculating depreciation where you would recognize more depreciation up front. So as we mentioned, straight line, same amount of depreciation expense each year. $100,000 over 5 years, $20,000 a year. So straight line, our annual depreciation that we recognize is the cost minus the residual value over the estimated useful life. So let's look at an example. So we have a $24,000 depreciable asset, 5-year useful life, and $2,000 residual value. Our annual depreciation expense, we take our $24,000 cost minus $2,000 residual value, divide that by 5 years, our depreciation is $4,400 a year. Double declining balance is accelerated, so we get to recognize more depreciation expense up front. So why would you want to do that? Well, we'll talk about it later, but when you use double declining balance, you have a higher depreciation expense in earlier periods. When your expenses go up, your taxable income goes down, and you can lower your tax liability to the government. So let's look at an example for double declining balance. So we're going to assume the same thing, $24,000 asset with a 5-year useful life and a $2,000 residual value. So ordinarily, we have a 5-year useful life, so we would recognize 20% of the depreciation a year, because 1 year over 5 total years, 1 over 5 is 20%. Well, with double declining balance, we're going to double that 20% and make it 40%. So we take our cost of $24,000 in year 1 times 40%, and we got our depreciation for year 1 to be $9,600. Our second year, we're going to take, well, if you look at the end of year 1, so we started out with $24,000, we multiplied that by 40%, got $9,600 of depreciation in year 1. So if we take the book value that we started with, less the yearly depreciation, our book value at the end of the year is $14,400. Year 2, we're going to take $14,400 times 40%, and we got our depreciation of $5,760. Do the same thing in year 4, year 3, year 4, year 5, we take the difference, and we depreciate the rest of the asset. So remember, the straight line rate, because it was 5 years, was 20%. The double declining balance, we would double it to 40%. And then at the end of the 5th year, we end up with our residual value of $2,000 as the book value of the asset. Remember, book value is the cost of the asset less accumulated depreciation. So comparing the two methods, we are both useful life in years. The depreciation expense with double declining balance, we have more depreciation expense in earlier years and less in later years. Where straight line, it's the same every month. So if we look at year 1 through 5 based on the example we just did, you could see years 1 and 2, we have more depreciation with double declining balance. Years 3, 4, and 5, we have more with the straight line method. So now taking a look at federal income tax. So we have what's called MACRS, Modified Accelerated Cost Recovery System. So there's 8 classes of useful life and depreciation rates for each class. And we don't use residual value when looking at MACRS for federal income tax purposes. So what happens with MACRS, you buy something, you go to the MACRS table, you put your asset into one of those 8 classes that the government defines, and that tells you the useful life and depreciation you can use. So for instance, if you buy an automobile or a light-duty truck, you would go to the MACRS table and you would learn that it's in the 5-year class of useful assets. So under MACRS depreciation, you have to use a 5-year useful life. For instance, if you buy a cash register, well, that would be a 7-year useful life asset. So you'd buy a cash register, go to the MACRS table, and you would learn that it's a 7-year useful life asset.